I see 10 o'clock, so I'd like to call this meeting of the State Board of Ed's Technical Advisory Committee to order. As Kellen doing roll call, thank you.
Chairwoman Schlossman.
Oh, here, yes.
Member Geyer.
Here.
Member Amrian Beardsley. Member Bachna.
Here.
Member Haladina.
Here.
Member Hovanetz.
Here.
Member Jordan.
Here.
And ADE representative.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. So our first agenda item today is to talk about the methodology for single letter grades for schools with non-typical school configurations. And I understand that Executive Director Williams has some information for us.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the TAC. So after conversations with many of the TAC members in regard to the data that they originally received from the department, it was brought to my attention that the original data file did not include the N count for those non-typical school configurations. The file now has that data, and that file was sent to you this morning from the department. There will be a section for N count of all schools, including the non-typical, and there will also be the FAE enrollment for non-typical school configurations. The data for non-typical school configurations are found both in the K-8 and the 9-12 file, as well as identifying the grades that the school serves. So all of that information you should have received this morning from the department. I guess my first question, though, is if any of the TAC members were able to look at the non-grade configuration schools and if they have some initial thoughts on what option could potentially work. If you remember, this item was given to you last week, and you were asked to bring some information back to this meeting.
I have some observations about the different options that were given in the PowerPoint to talk about the options. So I tend to think the most promising is so if prorated means weighted average, that would be the way to look at it. It also seems to be the most fair to do a weighted average. I understand that there are some concerns. I'll say the positives about it first. That would allow, and the State Board for Charter Schools did a similar type of thing in their academic framework. They weighted the number of students enrolled in each grade level when they looked at things like proficiency, so that each school had a different target. That's not necessarily the way we would want to do it, but having a weighted average seems the most appropriate. I understand, and we'll open that for discussion, that there may be some school configurations that do not have access to certain points in the 100-point or the scale, either with acceleration readiness, if it's a 3-5 configuration, for example, or the graduation if it's something up until 11. And so I think we could forward some thoughts, and I would like your guidance, Executive Director Williams, about how to do that. I know it is not the task of this group to make policy recommendations, but can we make recommendations about things to think about? For example, if a configuration does not include grade 12, would it be possible, instead of the graduation category, to have a target being on track toward graduation, so that we could look at the students that are in 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, depending on the configuration, who have accumulated enough credits to be on track towards graduation. That 5.5 as established by the State Board of Education.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the TAC, I believe that the State Board has been very clear that this committee is not to set policy. So let's not go down the road of setting policy. Let's stick with what they have given this committee to do, which was to look at the 6 options, 4 of which were presented to the department. 1 was the prorated weighting, and the 6th was a different option that this committee could come up with. Did any of the other committee members have any first initial thoughts on the non-typical grade configurations?
I had a chance to take a look. I'm sorry. I had a chance to take a look at that this morning and do a little bit of a look. I'm not ready to present all my notes of it because we're pretty limited on some of the data that we didn't have to really finish it off. And part of what I looked at were the say like the 612 schools, 712 schools configurations, some of those. And in looking at what their grades might be if we average the 2 grades from the K-8 model to the 912 model. And also the one question that I began to ask myself, which cut scores do we use? Do we use the 912 if we do the average, or do we use the K-8? Or do we use whichever one is better? So that's another question to ask. And by going through and looking at what the letter grades might be based on each one, for most of them it's going to remain the same, but it may change for a few of the schools, not very many. The only other observation is primarily charter schools that fit that model.
Thank you, Member Jordan. Chairman Schlesman, I believe Christy on the phone had a comment.
Yes. Member Hovanich?
Thank you. I had a chance to look at these 2. This is a policy decision. My strong recommendation would be to not use option number 1, which is the unique configurations, a different grading scale for each configuration, to not just select the better of the 2 schools, but to use either a model where the grading scale is based on the highest grade served. So if it has a grade 12 and a graduation rate, then that's the grading scale they would be on, or using a prorated grade, so long as the pro rating doesn't yield something in between a C and a B, or an A and a B. So essentially what would happen is whichever school was larger is what grade the configuration would carry. So if you had 60% in the lower configuration and 40% in the higher configuration, the lower configuration grade would prevail. So one of those 2 models, we've seen in other states attempting to go and use the better of the 2 grades, and it results in a lot of perverse behaviors on how schools organize in order to kind of play the system to get the better grade, and then also trying to set unique configurations for every single possible combination literally creates 30 or 40 different grading scales that are nearly impossible to keep track of. So either a prorated grade, which is based on whichever school is whichever configuration weights the most, or using whatever the highest grade is as the requirement for the configuration, would be the 2 options that I would support moving forward with this committee.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Hovanich, can you repeat the second part? I heard the prorated, but the second part was a little bit mumbled for me.
So the second way is whatever the highest grade served is the default grading scale that would be used. So if they served a grade 12, it would be the high school grading configuration. So for the K-12 school, it'd be the high school grading configuration.
Thank you.
Yes, Member Hovanich, this is Amy Schlesman. And that was, I think I've understood you, but I wanted to make sure I do. So what you are suggesting is, because at first I thought it was whichever of the configurations are the most. But then I think that what you're saying now that I've had the second clarification is that you're suggesting the highest grade level that is served, not the higher of the two letter grades. Is that correct?
Yes, there are two options
Okay.
I'm laying on the table that are typically used for these kind of situations in other states. One of them is a prorated grade based on whichever configuration has the greater number of students. So if the K-6, the K-5 configuration has more students than the high school configuration, the grade would default to whatever the grade is for the K-5 configuration. The other way they do it is look at the configuration, and whichever is the highest grade level served is the grading scale by which that school would be held accountable. So if they serve a grade 12, they would automatically be on the high school grading scale.
So I have a question for our group again, because maybe I didn't understand prorated the way that was intended, and so maybe I am suggesting an additional alternative here, number 6. I'm using the PowerPoint, refer to the numbers. And so I thought prorated was talking about more of a weighted average, but is that not what is intended? Because if it's not what is intended, I think I would like to suggest that we talk about a weighted average so that we look at the number of students who are within each model. And I was driving, so I didn't have the opportunity to look at the file that was sent this morning. But just to use even numbers, if a school has 100 students and 60% of them are in high school, 9 through 12, and 40% of them are in, or 40 are in K-8, whatever the configuration happens to be, then you would weight averaging the two letter grades appropriately. And I'm thinking that's not what I'm hearing now with prorating.
But if you did that, you would end up with something like an A- or a B+, right? And the grading scale doesn't have pluses and minuses. So you would have to decide it's essentially will come down to whichever school has the most kids will end up getting that grade unless there's an A and a D. And then they land somewhere in between based on the prorating. But most schools aren't going to be that disparate based on the data. Usually it's like an A and a B. And then what's the average of an A and a B?
Member Geyer?
Yeah, my understanding is that we would have to compute a weight, prorated average, and then decide which of the grading scales to use in order to assign the appropriate grade, be it the 9 to 12 or the K to 8 for that school. So there wouldn't be like an A- or a B+, because there would be a set grading cut for those classes of schools.
Dr. Schlesman, members of the TAC. So my understanding when we're talking about the prorating and when people came into the open houses and we're talking about the non-typical grade configurations is kind of a little bit what everyone is saying. If you have a 712 with 100 students and 60 students are in the 912 and 40 students are in the 7-8, then you would grade the 7-8 students on the K-8 model and you would grade the 60 students on the 912 model. Within those gradings, then you would average the both together, but you would place more weight on the section of the 912 because they have more students, and then you would have your letter grade.
Thank you for that clarification.
And that is option 4.
Yeah, okay.
And I also agree option 1's a non-starter.
Thank you, Member Bachna. And I think we can kind of go through the options. Do I hear consensus that option 1 is not an option? We don't want to pursue that option. Is anyone in favor of keeping that on the table? Okay, it doesn't sound like...
Chair Schlesman, when you ask each committee member, do you want to keep option 1, it would be best for the committee members to verbally say yes or no for the record.
Thank you. Okay. So, Member Jordan?
No, I'm not open to option 1.
Member Guyer?
No.
Member Haladina?
No opinion.
Okay. No opinion, okay.
No.
And I'm not interested in pursuing that one either.
Okay, so it looks like we can take option 1
Oh,
off the table.
and, sorry, Member on the phone, Hovanich? Hovanich. Okay. So option 2 about merging the outlier grades into one model. Member Jordan?
I can't really decide one way or the other.
Until you look at the data?
We need to look at more. We need to look at the new data that we have to
Okay.
really get some idea as to whether or not that might be effective.
Then do we want to hold on that one? Member Guyer, or
I say hold.
hold? Okay. Member Haladina? Dina? Help me with the pronunciation.
Tom? No opinion.
No opinion. Bachna? Member Bachna?
I'm fine with holding on that one until we look at the data that was sent this morning.
Okay. And Hovanich?
So just to be clear on this one I think is looking at, and Ms. Williams, if you can clarify, looking at the highest grade configuration. So if it was a school that served 411, it would be put into the school classification model that does not have graduation rate. If it has a grade 12, then it's part of the high school configuration, correct?
Chair,
Essentially looking at highest grade.
Chair Schlesman, Member Hovanich, I do believe that is correct. However, with the certain committee members who suggested holding off until they look at the data, I would recommend that that we just hold off on that one so that those committee members who have already agreed that they would do some modeling this week can use that option and bring back to this committee on the 28th.
So hearing that, do I need to go through the other options, or do we want to hold on the other? Was there anything, the non-starter was number 1. So
Chairman Schlesman, I think with the non-starter being number 1, and if everyone's in agreement that number 1 shouldn't even be modeled because it's not in the interest of the TAC to even do that, I had a conversation with Member Guyer and Member Jordan earlier this morning, and they have agreed that they will do some modeling this week for the non-typical grade configurations. So from what I have listened to thus far, it seems like option 1 is not on the table. However, the prorating, as Member Guyer was discussing, is on the table, and that is something that they would model for this committee and bring back on the 28th, as well as any other options I think were viable based upon the new data that the department gave them this morning.
So I do want to ask about number 3, though, because that would be a simple average of the 2 scores. As technically, I don't think that is the most equitable option, but I'm only one member of the TAC. So I'm interested to hear from the other members if they would like to pursue number 3, which is the simple average.
I'm okay with keeping it there just
Okay.
after that, because it would be nice to be able to look at what things will look like in terms of letter grades for schools in comparison to the other 2 or 3 options that are still available once we're able to process that data.
Okay.
Yeah, comparison model would be useful as a comparison model.
Okay, as a comparison.
Yeah.
Do any of my fellow committee members have additional comments on that?
No.
So do we have enough information now and enough of a plan to move forward with agenda item 1, which was and then to make a recommendation, because I understand the State Board of Ed is expecting a recommendation technically about the methodology for a single letter grade.
Chair Schlesman, that is correct. So the board is expecting a recommendation at the December 4th meeting. And I've already summarized, but I'll summarize again. So Member Guyer, Member Jordan will work this week to run some modeling on the options besides option 1 and bring that back to this committee at the 28th on Tuesday.
Thank you.
And I
So
believe with that, we can move on to the next
We'll move
agenda
on to
item.
next agenda item. So the next item was a presentation and discussion regarding the student number count, the N count, and that's used in the A through F accountability plan and the business rules. And the current N count is 20, with the exception of ELL.
So Chairman
So,
Schlesman, members
yes.
of the committee, this portion was given to Member Haladina and Chair Schlesman to look at in regards to the N count issues within the A through F accountability plan and the business rules. Again, this goes back to the issue with the initial data that was supplied by the department, is that it did not include the N count for each indicator. The AD's accountability team has created that for you, and they sent that to you this morning. So what I envision is that the same committee members, Member Haladina and Chair Schlesman, can look at N count again and bring back on the 28th. However, I still want to have a conversation in regards to what you two found with the N count and any thoughts that you have going forward, so that you can inform board staff. So you can inform board staff, and we can create a little bit of a report that we can bring back on the 28th. We really want to get started with this so that we have something to bring to the board at December 4th.
Thank you, Executive Director Williams. So one of the documents, I'm going to start with the simple one that I submitted about N count, is I was able to look at 2 other state accountability models and share that information with the group. And I included some information from California because I was able to speak with someone in the State Department in California. And and I'm not suggesting that we use an N size, or student count size of 30, but you can see that they use the number 30 because of the confidence level, margin of error, and then they include citations. So I thought that would be interesting rather than having us reinvent that wheel of looking at citations, that someone else has done that. It's always good to build on what has been done rather than reinvent it. They also give a statistical justification for it. So that is just there for your information. I also spoke with, or communicated with, some people at the Colorado Department of Education. You can see their credentials. They're in their Accountability and Data Analysis Department. Colorado uses an N count of 16 for achievement and the N size of 20 for growth. And you can see their justification is they do consider personally identifiable information, and I know that is one of our concerns. The N size of 20 for growth is for stability purposes. So I wanted to share that information for us going forward.
So if you're interested, I have a 50-state analysis of N sizes used in ESSA plans. There are 16 states that use an N size of 10, 1 state that uses an N size of 11, 4 states that use an N size of 15, 1 that was just talked about that uses an N size of 16, 18 that use an N size of 20, 3 that use an N size of 25, and 8 that use an N size of 30. That's for their accountability system. A majority of these states use a much smaller N size for reporting. So for accountability purposes, we see N sizes 20 states, or 39 plus DC, 40 states total use an N size of 20 or less. Most common N size actually is 20, but there are 22 states that use an N size smaller than 20. So it's not unprecedented to use 20 or anything 30 and lower.
Thank you very much, Member Jovanovic. Have you submitted that document to Executive Director Williams so that we can all see it?
No, it's one of my working papers that will be published next week as our 50 state analysis, and we'll be more than welcome to share it next week. But are in the process of putting together these work papers. Just one other aside, too, is a majority of the states do not use in their accountability ratings themselves, they're combining components of their system, complex statistical calculations.
You're breaking up on us, so can you start again, because that was important information. I'd like us all to hear it.
So, a majority of the states' accountability systems, when you're looking at individual components being aggregated into a summative rating, of which 44 states have a summative rating, they are not using complex statistical types of aggregations. They're simply using mathematical aggregations of universes. So a majority of states in their ESSA plans have stated that the reason for the smaller N size is because they are evaluating a universe of students, and most of their calculations do not have any statistical processes associated with them. They're mainly mathematical. The ones that do have the statistical processes associated with them are accounting for that error already within the calculations, such as student growth percentiles, in and of itself before using it as a component.
Thank you, Member Havanich. I think that is very important information, and that provides insight for me as one committee member that this is more numeric and less statistics or inferential statistics. Do any of the rest of us have comments?
I think I made a comment before, so I'll make it again because I like to repeat myself. When we talk about states do this, states do that, I'm more concerned about whether or not the states do it right, rather than just take a poll and say all the states do it, therefore it's right. So my concern is getting it correct. And with these class means and the N counts, all these numbers are very small. So with a standard error of the mean, you're going to have big margin of error regardless. And I think that impacts how you classify schools. And then we haven't talked about the reliability of these class means either. And I haven't heard any talk about that. And then another factor, which you and I have discussed, Dr. Schlussman and I have discussed privately, is that there are factors that may bias these scores. And that's not considered in N counts at all. We're just looking at random error. We're not looking at systematic error. And I think systematic error is a threat in all state testing, all accountability systems. And until you look at systematic error, I think there's a threat to having a valid use of a test score.
Thank you, Member Tom. And you have shared with us a working draft?
Yes.
With your concerns and questions about the Arizona A through F accountability system. I am skimming it now. And I don't see that specific, and I'm trying to stay with the agenda items because some of your points will fit into other agenda items. Is there something other than the cut scores and random error that you would like to point out for this agenda item?
No.
So now that we have, should I call on each of us individually to make sure we have input on the end size, or is this all pending, again, the data file that we've now received?
Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, if other committee members want to voice their concerns in regard to the end count, they're more than welcome to. However, knowing that the end count was not included in the original data that was shared from the department, however, this is something that the TAC is going to have to look at and really answer some of those questions. Is if the end count was to be lowered, would more schools be captured within the accountability system? This is really important for small schools who have voice that they have very good data, but they're not captured because of the high end size of 20. So I would recommend to the committee that whether it's Member Haladina or Chairman Schlesman, since this was given to you first, is to look at the end count sizes with the new data that was supplied by the department to determine if a potential different end size would be more sufficient. I do want to point out that from my conversations with the accountability section of the department, the end size has to remain the same within the subgroups. However, the ELL calculation can be different, so that the end count and the ELL can be different, and that is a relatively new finding.
Yeah, thank you, Executive Director Williams, because I had that question and I didn't. Is that an ESSA requirement that the end count remain the same except for ELL, or is that a policy that has been set by the State Board of Ed? Where did that come from?
Chairman Schlesman, I do believe that is an ESSA.
Okay, that is an ESSA. Thank you. Yes, Member Bachna.
My concern with lowering the end count is the variability from year to year. We might be able to get more schools' grades by lowering that end count, but as we lower it, the variation from year to year will be a lot more dramatic. So I think that's something to take into account.
Thank you, Member Bachna.
Yeah,
Member Guyer?
Yes, thank you. I have a few comments, and I'm going to be sending this file off to Director Williams later. I'm still kind of a rough draft. One of the thoughts that came to my mind was that these comparisons, at least within the acceleration, which is a later topic I know, but are all or nothing. So one of the thoughts and concerns that I had was all or nothing comparisons or decisions using these small ends kind of doubles down on the concern that Member Tom had regarding the error measurement. So I definitely think some more like graded decisions, like maybe below all, at or near or above, could potentially. And again, I don't want to get into policy, but I just wanted to raise that concern vis-a-vis the ends, that we are making all or nothing decisions with small numbers of students.
Thank you.
My biggest question about the end count was it an issue of potentially identifying individual students, or that of a statistical aspect of the calculation? When you consider that when the state reports out the AZ merit, they have an end count of 10, and we're using an end count of 20 for the calculation. But then again, I also share the same concerns as my colleagues up here. If we start lowering the end count, could that lead to some year-to-year swings in terms of a school's letter grade? How much of a dynamic is that? And then also taking a look at the acceleration readiness. We do have some sites, some schools around the state that do not have the demographics in which to get all the many of the 2 points possible in that. And I know that's going to come up a little bit later in discussion. So if they're limited in what they can earn, how much does it impact the smaller schools?
Thank you.
So Member Schlesman, members of the committee, what we can do is we can take the N count questions and the determination of, maybe figuring out if we need to lower the N count, and we can table that until the 28th, if that is what this committee desires to do, because we have that new data from the department.
I know I would like to look at the new data in that lens.
So we will table the N count to the meeting on the 28th with the same type of information. I believe we can move on to the next agenda item.
Thank you. So the next agenda item is the proficiency issues.
So Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, proficiency, it should be growth, actually. 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped. I was writing my notes on the wrong agenda item. Sorry. Yes. Growth is the first.
It's a presentation discussion regarding growth issues within the accountability plan and business roles. So Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, this was reviewed by Member Beardsley and Member Bachna. Member Beardsley is not here. However, Member Bachna does have her notes, and so Member Bachna will be able to tell you some of the topics that they discussed within the growth measure. And I'm going to have Ketcher pass out the paperwork to you.
Thank you. So in looking at the data and looking at the notes that Audrey has gone from the more academic standpoint, I've kind of gone from looking at the data file, and we worked together on, we both had our comments on this. Ultimately, schools, one of the big things is, do highly proficient schools all get A's? And in looking at the data, they don't all get A's. The majority get A's. The growth does affect the percentages of schools getting A's. So if a school is high growth but not, high proficiency but not high growth, all of them are not receiving A's right now. High proficiency schools need to earn points on growth and acceleration or CCRI to get to an A. One of the things that came up was, should all growth be weighted the same? And I know that when they were looking at this throughout the school year in the committees, they found that when they weighted the growth the same for all performance levels, the correlation to poverty increased. And higher growth weights for proficient students decreased the potential for every school in the state to earn an A. I postulate that maybe the perspective should be that we look at weighting in the 50-30 percentages, proficiency versus growth. Maybe the schools should have an option of choosing one or the other, whichever is higher, if we're looking to look at differences with growth. I think we need to consider what defines 1 year's growth going forward, and where is the greatest need in our model to differentiate growth. Currently, all student growth targets are to proficient, and should they be? I think the business roles for the student growth target need to be evaluated for students at the highest end of the student growth target, because I think we're not capturing all of that high growth.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachman, can I stop you right there?
Yes.
In your notes, it says currently students who earn an SGT, as in Tom, of 89 or higher only earn an at or near score point because they can't be considered for above score points. Could you please explain that for the committee?
This is looking at the data from my school district, but we saw that we're not seeing, it's a ceiling effect. Once that they hit that 89 or higher, they were only getting the at or near score point. They weren't getting the high. So the growth to target has a 1, 2, or 3 based on the different growth percentiles.
So Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachna, so what you're saying is students that are above the proficiency aren't receiving the points for SGT?
There's a cap, basically.
There's
at the top.
a cap on it. Okay. So Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachna, would you say that probably would be seen in other schools that are facing the same issue with that SGT calculation?
It could be.
Would that be something that we could potentially bring to the state board to have this, for them to tell this committee to look at?
Sure.
Yes. Do any other members of the committee have any thoughts on the SGT and that capping that occurs with the students who are already at the target? Or is that something that the committee would like Member Guyer and Member Jordan to look at.
I was going to ask us I think I figured this out. Member Beardsley's comments are in the red and yours are in the blue. Thank you very much. And because I've been tracking your...
What I'm saying. Yes,
yeah. And then from what I've seen, the SGT capping definitely should be considered by the State Board of Ed. My fellow committee members can talk about whether that needs to be modeled or if we can just go forward with that as an issue in the report.
Can I just add one thought on that, and that is that yes, thank you. Is I have heard some concerns raised on my job about the cap or the ceiling effects on the AZ merit and what that can do to the growth target scores. So one possible thing that I've been postulating about is could we potentially have more categories of students in terms of rather than just having highly proficient, proficient, and so on. Maybe to take that into account into the model so that if a student is so high in proficiency that they can't get an SGT more than 10 points, that be reflected in the model.
Thank you, Member Guyer.
Yep.
I'm also very cautious of the not getting into the policy concerns, but I also agree with the idea of pursuing the idea of, and the word that's been used in Arizona for years is float weight, and I know and that can't happen, I understand. But is there a way to have a school or adjust the model to recognize the schools that are highly proficient versus the schools, or not versus, but growth? Because I saw some heads nod in the audience too when Member Bachna was making her comments.
Sure. So, Chairman Schlesman and committee members, the float weight has been something that has been talked about with the AG's office. So we don't want to go down this rabbit hole of saying, we need to look again at the float weight, and maybe that's a conversation we have after later. But remember, the State Board has given this task of looking for these problematic issues, such as what Member Bachna has discovered with the SGT. They're capping those students, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking at the data to determine if there's any other issues that the board needs to be aware of, so that the board can give direction to this TAC and say, please go look at this, let's model it, and bring us back a recommendation in January. We have to get the 16-17 letter grades finalized, and this committee has been tasked with finding the problematic issues, again, such as Member Bachna brought up. If I may, Chairman Schlesman, I would like to go back to question number 1 that Member Bachna was discussing when she said the schools that exhibited both high growth and high proficiency received A's. Schools that demonstrated high proficiency but not as much growth received B's.
Not all, but some.
Some of them, okay.
Okay.
So my question is, when board staff was meeting with a lot of different people who had come in for open houses and through feedback that the board has received through the impacts in the survey, I'd be interested to know, and maybe this is something that you can look into with the new data, Member Bachna, is if those schools that are highly proficient in terms of their proficiency, right, but are not receiving all of the growth points, right, so they're getting that B grade. The question would be, why are they receiving that B grade? For example, if a student is 67% proficient, highly proficient in the proficiency category, and they have almost all of their proficiency points, but they don't earn all of their growth points, is there an issue with how the growth is calculated for those proficient and highly proficient students? Or is that 1/3 of their students who are not proficient and highly proficient not growing? And that has been a main theme that has occurred within our offices that hopefully someone on this committee can answer, right? Because if you have students who are not growing, then that would be an issue for the school, because your student is minimally proficient, partially proficient, and not growing.
I'm not sure that can be looked at through the aggregate data that's been provided.
Okay.
One other thing I have noticed, though, and going back and looking at the AZ Merit MSAA 17 file and the AZ Merit MSAA 16 file that's posted publicly on the accountability website, is those schools that were in that category, their proficiency levels overall were down from the previous school year. So I am seeing a trend there where that's probably contributing to the growth, where we're not seeing as much growth at those schools. Their percent passing was higher in 16 than in 17.
Thank you, Member Bachner.
Do we have further comments on?
Oh, Member Bachner has more.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I'm mostly, I think I was kind of summarized the details to get through the agenda here. The other thing I guess I would just look at, again, the K model. I'm looking at number 5. The lowest correlation to poverty was determined when they did this 50% proficiency growth. That was presented in April as a 0.42 to the school board. Ultimately, there's never going to be a weighting measurement that's going to reduce the correlation to 0 for proficient to free and reduced lunch. For the point on question 6 that was raised to us, is this model too complex? Kind of considering, from my standpoint, the model does need to be complex in order to get away from just having a single test score be the end-all, be-all. I'd like to actually see more added to the CCRI and acceleration measures and more nuances of things that could be added to allow more schools to obtain points. And that kind of summarizes it for me.
So now I can ask if other members have additional comments.
I can make a comment, but I'm going to apologize for not being up to date on this. Plus, also, we're getting paper handed out here at the. I didn't have a chance to really read it, so I apologize. I don't apologize for that. I just think it's difficult to comment when we haven't even read some of the new documents. But anyway, I have some experience with growth and proficiency, and I'm sure many of you know this already, that having worked with the Stanford Achievement Test, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and the AZ Merit, and the AIMS, and the other tests that preceded it, there is an asymptotic, I'm sorry to use that term, but what it means is that as we approach 8th grade, there's no growth at all. So you're expecting growth out of 8th graders. You're not going to get much, but you probably know this already, I think, don't you?
Thank you for making that point.
Okay. So I don't know
Might be something that should be included in the report.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know how an accountability system takes that into consideration. Also, growth measures are tremendously unreliable if they're done at the student level. That's always been the case, and I can cite you papers that discuss this. So I would be concerned about that, and I think I put that in my little comments section too about growth measures. I really don't, I'm not very well prepared, and I haven't had time to really study the accountability system, so I'm basically an outsider here. I really don't know exactly what you do.
So, Dr. Schlesman, Member Haladina, I hear you say that you're an outsider and you don't know what to do, so please give board staff direction of how we can further help you in understanding this accountability system.
I think you have already. I just haven't been able to consume the information adequately with the short timelines we have.
Sure. And so to just address that quickly, Chairman Schlesman, Member Haladina, going forward after December 4th, board staff plans on have standing meetings for the Technical Advisory Committee, so it's easier on your schedule and also easier on board staff to make sure that we get materials out to you in a timely manner. We realize that the short time frame right now between when the TAC was established and the board due dates is short, so we do recognize that. We have plans to put things into motion for your schedules.
Thank you, Executive Director Williams, for clarifying that. And the other thing I would ask Member Haladina, did I pronounce that correctly this time? Okay. If you have citations about growth that we can include in a report to the State Board of Ed, I think that would be helpful.
How many do you want?
How many do you want? Or,
Chairman Schlesman, Member Haladina, if you want to bring those to the meeting on the 28th, that would be sufficient. That would be fine.
Are you referring to actual documents or just citations in a reference list?
Whichever you prefer, Member Haladina.
It's going to be citations in a reference list.
So this is Christy Hovanitz. I have a couple comments or things to add to the growth calculation conversation. One, based on some of the comments that
Member Hovanich, would you please, sometimes you come across loud and clear, so it might be the distance of you to your speaker.
Okay. So I have a couple things that would cause, so federally I don't think that would meet as a requirement, but also it would not allow for direct comparisons from school to school. The second thing I'd be a little bit concerned about is factoring in additional risk factors to the model to essentially set different expectations for different kids. We are already controlling for prior performance, which typically explains the majority of the variance in any of the models that you have. So prior year performance, I think, proxy pretty well for a lot of the other risk factors. And going any further into that, I think we are going to be setting too low of expectations for students. The third thing that we haven't really talked about is how the points are assigned using the student growth percentiles and the student growth to target. I'm very concerned that a student who is minimally proficient can earn twice as many points as a student who is highly proficient for doing exactly the same thing. And I'm also concerned that guaranteed we will have 33% failure rate for low growth, where schools and students will earn no points, and a guaranteed 33 or 66% success rate, 67% success rate year over year, no matter what overall student performance happens. So concerned about the normative nature of this model is set up, and also how points are awarded for this model as well. So those are two things that I would be very interested in somebody looking at on the TAC, is if we used the same points awarded in SGP and SGT, how differently the model would look, given that high-performing kids are generally compared to themselves in these models. Low-performing kids are compared to themselves as well. And so I'm very concerned about how the points are assigned, the normative nature of it, and the guaranteed failure rates by using this normative model.
I want to ask for clarification from Member Hovanich. So your concern is the normative nature of the entire SGP model, the growth model, correct?
That's one of them, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I know you had three, but I was asking for clarification about that one point.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Hovanich, could you take all of that information and send it to me so that I have it written out? I tried my best. I just didn't want to miss anything.
Yes, it was articulated in the initial two-pager I sent.
Okay, I have that in front of me as well. Thank you.
Yep.
And Member Vanich, we just received this document from members Beardsley and Bachna, but is that captured a bit in the answer to number 1 from
Chairman Schlesman,
for Beardsley?
her documentation from last meeting is being passed out by Ketcher.
Oh, thank you.
Just so that you have the information. I think going forward, what we can do is take some of the thoughts that Member Bachna and Member Beardsley had in that document, as well as the information that was just presented by Member Hovanich, that we can put that into a summary, and we can bring that summary back to you on the 28th. So that would include what Member Bachna was talking about in regards to the SGT and the capping of those highest.
Yes.
And so that we could bring that information to the board, and if they want to look down that avenue, then they can tell the TAC to go ahead and model that so we can see the potential impact and outcomes of that data. And then what I will do is I will take the other information that was presented by Member Hovanich, and we will also put that into the report, those 3 different points. We'll bring the report back, and then the members can look at it again prior to submitting it to the board.
And is it possible that we could have this a few days? And I know with the holiday, it's really tricky with the
Chairman
meeting
/ members of the
that's
committee.
coming up.
It was I was going to work on this later tonight.
Thank you.
After
Thank you so
business
much.
hours.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman / members of the committee, did anyone else have any questions or comments in regards to the growth measures on the A through F plan and business rules?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Uh,
Thank you.
You can guide me on my answer. I don't want to throw away this idea about risk. I heard Dr. Hovanich speak about prior achievement as a substitute for risk. And I think I would challenge that statement. I need to know more about how knowing prior achievement does correct for risk, because risk is a very complex variable. And as I said before, using poverty as a measure of risk is misrepresents what risk is. That risk is a lot more complex. Unless you consider all the factors of risk, you really don't capture the deficit that at-risk students have. So I guess I would like to know more about the rationale for why prior achievement covers the variable that we call risk.
Thank you.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Haladina, I think with the whole risk portion that was discussed in your handout that you gave me this morning, I think that's something that this committee could definitely look at going forward. Right, so we have an accountability system that has already it's been established. Preliminary grades have been run on it. Let's focus on what we have right now, and then we can make adjustments to it for future later years. Right, so I'm assuming that risk piece and how you speak of it is going to play into what happens for future accountability systems to make sure that the data is reliable and valid.
Okay, my question to you then is how will that discussion be introduced, or will it be in our report, or will it be postponed until a later date?
Chairman / Member Haladina, I believe it would be postponed, right? So the report needs to focus on things that we have seen in the current data, right? Just very, like Member Bachna stated. There looks to be a capping on the student growth targets, right? And so that could have a potential negative impact on schools and their letter grades. What the board wishes to do is that have this report go then to December. Then the board would state to the TAC, we want you to look at X, Y, and Z and run modeling, come back to us with a recommendation in January. Now, all of your terms, I believe, are 3 years. So it's something that we can continue to discuss after these first asks of the state board are finished.
Thank you for that clarification. Have we all had a chance to speak about growth? We can move forward to agenda item 4, which is the proficiency.
Okay.
And we could lead
Chairman Schlesman,
yes.
members of the committee, I believe that the proficiency issues were being addressed by Member Hovanich and Member Jordan. Member Jordan, would you like to present first?
Well, the one document that I gave to you before we began that's in front of you, it's more focused on acceleration readiness because that was one of 2 areas that you gave us. And the other one about proficiency, and I didn't really have time to really package everything together that in addressing the questions. I'm trying to find my notes that I had. Because let me get back to the original questions. For proficiency, one of the questions is how does the current weighting of proficiency impact schools with both within the stability model and the weighting of the different levels of proficiency? So what I interpreted from that is that we have proficiency where schools can earn points either through just straight proficiency based on the AFAY or based on 3-year stability FAY. And so whichever one is higher in terms of proficiency that's where the students get the most points. They'll get those points. And what I interpreted out of that is, did it have some sort of an impact on schools, whether or not they get a letter grade? And just running some basic regression analysis and even breaking it down by each, by free and reduced lunch, by each category, whether it's 0 to 10%, all the way up to 90% or higher. Each one of them, the correlation is about 90 to 98%, depending on the group. So it's the only unique observation out of all that is at the 80 schools that are about 80% for free and reduced lunch to about 90%. That's the only group where that correlation dropped below 90%. So from that perspective, I think the stability and the proficiency is doing what it intended to do. So depending on how the students, we know they have some schools where they're going to be more stable year after year after year, and other schools where there may be greater mobility of students from year to year. But in getting the points, in having consistency in the points that they earn, I didn't see anything unusual. The only other observation in taking a look at it and breaking it down by free and reduced lunch is that students have proficiencies at schools with very few students on free and reduced lunch. They all tend to cluster very, very high along that continuum, whereas where schools are much higher at free and reduced lunch, they all cluster toward the bottom end of that. And I've got graphs that I can copy and paste and put in a printout and share it with you to kind of see that. And I think it would be reasonable to expect that based on what we've seen in data just across the statewide in terms of just the raw data, the data that's being presented through the Arizona Merit proficiency rate reports that the state provides for download at the state, because it's going to follow a similar pattern.
So, Chairman Slupson, Member Jordan, when you were looking at the FAY, the full academic year, did you happen to see if there was really a difference in regard to the stability model?
I didn't see any difference, very little, if any at all. So the two behave very similar.
Okay.
As a clarification, Member Jordan, I did hear you say that the stability model is doing what it was intended to do. So
yeah, it's when you have a school that has a proficiency rate of 2 different places, whether the schools were whether the students were consistently enrolled for 3 years or 1 year, and then they have 2 scorers, and they get the higher of the 2 scorers. And even in that, when you break down the total possible points from either one, it's still about the same. About 50%, 50 to 55% of the schools, I think that's right, got the stability point as opposed to their straight proficiency. So that's how close it is. To me, I don't see anything really big or unusual about that.
Sure. So, Chairman Slepshin, Member Jordan, so a lot of the conversation that we had with the open houses and the feedback was that the calculations to the A through F system was very confusing to the public, right, to the general public. When you were looking at the proficiency, I heard you say that if you looked at one student and you looked at the proficiency with no stability model and you looked at proficiency with a stability model, there wasn't really a difference, maybe like a 1 to 6% difference in the scores?
The difference is very, very small. Very small. Yeah, it's and again, even if there is a difference, they're going to get the higher of the 2 scores. It's an either-or kind of thing, so it doesn't really matter. They're going to benefit by getting the higher score. And if a school is a highly effective school, we would assume that if the student is there for 3 consecutive years for FAY, and a large percentage of the students are FAY during that time, that we would expect them to perform very, very well after that. We would obviously see that in the data. So, but if we don't, then it's still showing some consistency overall in terms of basic proficiency of students on the Easy Merit.
Thank you, Member Jordan.
Member Hovenich, I think last meeting you made some observations about how the points are assigned for proficiency. Would this be an appropriate time to talk about those again? Or do you have other comments that you would like to make?
I have several, but yes, that's one of them. So one, I do think we overcomplicate the proficiency calculation by using an index system. So we're not just looking at whether or not, or we're not just looking at whether or not students are achieving grade level expectations. We're looking at and aren't able to tell from an index calculation, how well the school is accomplishing that, because it is, again, an index calculation. We're awarding, partial points, 0.6 points to a student who's not yet proficient, a full point for proficient students, and 1.3 points for students above proficiency. So really changing the perspective of what the percent proficient actually looks like to be an index rather than an actual percent of students proficient. So that's one of the concerns, is the representation of what the percent proficient actually means is actually an index, not truly a percent proficient. The second thing is the business rules aren't clear how they actually determine 3 full academic year enrollments, which is one of the things that I was hoping you could get clarification on. If a student is enrolled in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade full academic year, is their 3rd grade score considered a 3-year score, or is it just a 1-year score because it's the first year of testing? And then likewise, are all students who are in middle school, where it's a 6, 7, 8, 8th grade is the only year where a kid could possibly have 3 years worth of data for the stability calculation. I'm really concerned with the stability calculation as it might not wholly represent the performance of the school, given that you are looking at select kids and then using the highest of the calculations would be a significant concern. So getting some clarification around the reason for that, especially given the 1-year look of proficiency rates compared to 2- and 3-year look, on average statewide, it might not make that much of a difference, but when you're looking at individual schools, these rates can be pretty different, and we want, I think, to have the realistic perspective of what percent of students are proficient or proficient per the proficiency index, not really percent proficient. And then I also am concerned about how the high school proficiency rate is calculated, because it's only based on the grade 12 full academic year students, and students are not tested annually in high school. So it's only looking at students in grade 12 that were there for a full academic year as to whether or not they had a test score in one of the 4 previous years to be included. So you're really not accounting for any kids who have dropped out, moved before their senior year, and doesn't actually represent how well a high school is performing. It's only representing how many kids persevered through 12th grade and stayed there for the full academic year, and what their score was maybe 2, 3, or 4 years ago. So a bit of a concern about how high school proficiency is calculated as well.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, I apologize, Hunter, I don't know your last name.
Overstreet.
Member Overstreet, can you take that note back to the department in regard to Member Hovanich's question to how they determine that 3-year FAE, and see if we can have an answer. You can email the answer to me, and then I can distribute it amongst the members.
Will do.
Thank you. Chairman Schlesman, did any of the other committee members have any questions or comments in regards to the proficiency measure?
Chairman, yeah, my analysis was limited to the K-8 model since I represent a K-8 district. That's where my primary focus is much of the time, so I didn't even give any thought of looking at the 912.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, just to address Member Jordan's last comment in regards to, since he's the K-8 representative, not looking at the 912, and that's fine for this at this current moment, since this was most likely not addressed. However, going forward, it is very important for each committee member to not only look at what they're on the TAC for, but to look at the system as a whole. Your expertise would be K-8. But knowing that we also have 912, and from my understanding, data is data. So just look at it to have that those answers available for proficiency. But for this moment, this is fine right now for that K-8.
Well, given the short timeline, that's about all the time that I had to just do that analysis.
Member Jordan, that is fine, and we appreciate that.
I have a question to Member Hovanich. Or actually, it may be to you if this would be appropriate this time or perhaps not, because I'm still trying to clarify our task. And I think it's challenging for many of us, because where we draw the line between what is an issue with the current model and what smacks of a policy decision. But when Member Hovanich talks about we've overcomplicated the proficiency index we've overcomplicated proficiency by using an index rather than just straight proficiency. I think the index was come to because of a recommendation to try and alleviate the correlation with free and reduced lunch. So is our task at the moment to talk about the use of the index and raise the questions, or would it be also productive to do some modeling about what would happen if just straight proficiency. And can you help me, Member Hovanich? Would you think that would be helpful? Did you take a look at that? What the calculation would look like if it was just straight percent proficient and not an index?
So without student level data, that question is unanswerable by us.
Okay.
And I have not been able to look at that. And again, a lot of these decisions sound like policy decisions, but these data are driven explicitly by what policy decisions had been made already and are artifacts of these policy decisions. So it's very difficult to separate out what's a policy decision and what's a data decision, because everything we're looking at is a result of policy decisions that have previously been made.
Thank you. Helps me. I don't know if it helps other committee members.
What is the board's priority right now in terms of what we're doing? Do they have a hierarchy of priorities?
Yes. Chairman/Member Member Bachna, so this TAC committee thus far has been charged with coming with a recommendation for the non-typical school configurations to the December 4th meeting, and then to come with a report in regards to any problematic issues within the A through F plan and business rules. The TAC has been told that they will not form any policy decisions, but Member Hovanovich is correct where she says that the data that you're looking at is based upon the policy that has already been set by the board, right? So the TAC is to review the data that has been given to you by the department to determine if there are any issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you.
And to bring those issues to the board in December so the board can say, TAC, please go look at these things and make a recommendation of how we can fix them.
Chairman Schlesman, I'm looking at it from the realm or the parameter that the current letter grade model that we have in front of us is what we're looking at and nothing more. We're looking at the current data that we have and nothing more. And that we're looking at it from the viewpoint, is there anything that we're seeing within the data in relation to the current business rules as they are written that are unusual or anomalies or things that may affect a school's letter grade that may have been easily overlooked in the development of the model and as the state board approved the model. So I've been looking at this within those parameters, irregardless of my opinion or my philosophical perspectives of the various aspects of the model. So, because it was the State Board of Education that decided on the framework and the model, and then they've come to this point of releasing letter grades, and now that we got the preliminary letter grades, we're coming back and taking a second look. Are things is what the state board perceived it to report out about our schools. So that's how I'm looking at it, and that's how I'm approaching it within that framework. And then once we get beyond January, then we can begin to tackle or revisit some of the supporting aspects of the model.
Thank you, Member Jordan. I see some heads nodding in the room too, so thank you very much. Do we have further observations about proficiency? Hearing none, we could move forward to agenda item 5, which is acceleration.
Chairman/member members of the committee, the acceleration presentation and discussion regarding acceleration issues within the A through F accountability plan and business rules were given to Member Geyer and Member Jordan. Member Jordan has, looks like he ran some numbers, made some charts, did some stuff. So he is.
Just referring back to the original questions that you asked us to look at in response to the state board's request, how many schools received the total amount of points that were available to them, even if the total points that they were eligible for was under 10. And so each one of these charts, what I tried to do is show you in the far left-hand corner of that very first graph, the total acceleration points that were earned by schools. Some schools earned as few as 2. Some schools earned as many as 10, and that was the cap. And then I broke it down by free and reduced lunch, filtering by that category so that we could begin to see the distribution at each point category. And then the next table underneath that is just taking the raw numbers and just turning it into percentages so that we can see what kind of distribution it is by free and reduced lunch as well as total points earned.
May I ask a question
Sure.
here? Because I saw that on some of the data that I ran also, the idea of blank. So was a blank a null, or was it?
It was a null.
Okay, because there was a period, too, on some
and I'm
of
just
them.
assuming, for whatever reason, the school has not been identified as having a free and reduced lunch. And that may be true in the data. That's a question to ask ADE. Do we have some schools that are not a part of the free and reduced lunch? Have they not reported that? Have they not collected that data from certain schools?
I'll look into that. I'll let you know.
And moving on beyond that, let's see, the next question that we were asked, how many schools were eligible for the full 10 points but did not receive the full points because they did not meet the criteria? Is there a way to assess the validity of the criteria? Assessing the validity of it, I don't know yet. I'm still sifting through that. But as you see in the notes, I have, just based on observations, what I saw in looking at it. Since we didn't have any hard numbers of students tested or students enrolled, I didn't have that information, so I went back to the AZ Merit released by schools to pull down the data that I needed. And so there's one part of it, it's really more reflective of that spreadsheet that's available from the ADE, from the download, where I show that about 400 out of 1,300 schools do not get the grade 3 minimally proficient reduction just simply because they don't have a grade 3. And then about another 1,122 schools out of 1,300 do not get the end of the course calculation, and it might be that either they don't serve grades 6, 7, and 8, or they don't have any students at all taking the Algebra 1 test. And then another question that I have is that within that data set that's available from ADE by each school, they break down the number of 8th graders who took Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2, but I didn't see any indication as to whether or not 7th graders were taking that. So I don't know how accurate that data is within our analysis of limited to the school's letter grades. So that's why I put that in there, and I just want to explain to where I got that data, because it wasn't within that initial data set that we got for the school letter grades. But it sounds like we might have that now. Let's see. And then focusing in on the subgroups, and the subgroups is where they can get to two bonus points. And once again, pulling from that same data set, I think there's about 9 or 10 possible subgroups that schools can earn points for. And when you consider they're going to earn points for both ELA and math, that's a total of about 18, 20. So, and then multiply that times 2. But we're assuming that the schools are diverse enough to where they can get all those points. And we know that that's not the case with some of our schools across the state. So as you get to the next tables, once again, I'm trying to break that out. First, looking at the end-of-course assessment, students in grades 5 through 8. And then breaking that down by free and reduced lunch for each of the schools. How many schools did not get any of the points, and then the percentage of schools that got 5 points, and then the percentage of schools that were not eligible to get those points. So just simply because they don't have either grades 5 through 8 or they don't offer those classes to the students in those grade levels. Likewise, grade 3 decreased the mentally proficient on ELA. Showing the distribution there, same kind of thing. You can see the percentage of schools that did not get the 5 points for ELA, grade 3, and then also the percentage of schools that were not eligible, and also the distribution per each free and reduced lunch bin. Subgroup performance is another thing that we looked at. And this is answering the question, what were the maximum amount of points that schools earned? We did have some schools that earned, and I think it continues on the next page. There were a couple of schools that earned the full 30, I don't want to say earned the full 30 points, but earned 30 points. But they're capped at 10. Also, we had 130 schools who did not get any points for whatever reason. It may be that their in count was too low to where they could get counted. They didn't have groups that represented each of the subgroups. And then you see the distribution beyond that. But that's what is reporting there. And then I created another table breaking that even further by the percentage of students based on free and reduced lunch, and so that we could see that. And the whole reason for doing this was to try, do we see any clustering of data? Do we see, are we seeing some consistency throughout the data? So that's, my concern is, are the schools that do not have enough subgroups? And that's the next part of looking at this. Of the schools that did not get any points, or only got 2 or 4 points, and until I get to the actual numbers of students, I won't know if they're just not eligible for that. But obviously, what's built into the model is that what's identified, what are the total points possible that the school could possibly earn, and then it's then their letter grade is based on a percentage of that, and that's how they get there. And so that's an effort to kind of treat all the schools equitably, but it's still we need to look at that. And then the other idea, if we have a few schools who cannot score many points because they're not diverse enough, what are some other things that could be identified as possible subgroups to where they can score the additional points that they need?
Chairman Schlesman, Member Jordan, going off of something you just said that, again, brought up many times in open houses and survey and whatnot, is that idea of points possible. If a school is only eligible for 6 points, you would calculate the points that they earned based upon a percentage, correct? So if they're eligible for 6 points, but they only earned 4, then you would have a percentage of that to equal the 10?
Well, possibly. Right now, I just kept it within the context of the schools that did not get the full 10 points. I'm asking the question of why. And then beyond that, I know that once they get to the total points calculated, and then the total points, with the total points possible, meaning that for the subgroups, they get what, 6 points possible for that, or is it 10? 10 points possible. So,
10?
yeah.
It might be 10.
Yeah, it's, it's not until they get close to the final calculation that they get the adjustment for the total points possible. But within the subgroup, if their total points possible is limited to, as you described, there are 6, then it probably needs to be sort of prorated, you might say, for that particular school in that context, so they have a chance to get the full 10 points.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Jordan, thank you for running these numbers and having this data provided to the committee members. It's very useful, very helpful. Member Guyer, did you have anything that you'd like to add or discuss?
Yes, thank you, Director Williams. I will be providing you, Director Williams, with the draft of the initial analysis that I did on this, and I was mostly focused on the subgroup improvement variable just because the data in there was so compelling and interesting, and I had some questions about it. I did run a school participation by subgroup improvement category for the 10 categories for ELA and math, and you can see how some of the subgroups in there were only two or fewer, or a small number of schools were even eligible to earn those points. So just some general like methodological questions and concerns regarding the measure at large, just because of the number of shots that schools have at earning their 6-point limit. So those are most of my concerns. I already mentioned the concern that came out as well from the looking at the acceleration and readiness, which was the sort of business rules surrounding the assignment of points, being if you're above the target, you receive full points. If you're below at any level, you receive no points.
Chairman Schlesman, Members Guyer and Jordan, so if you had to give an issue to the board, what would that issue be?
Well, the one sort of highlight concern for the school participation sort of subgroup improvement is that it seems to me like the subgroup improvement by nature is favoring or is more favorable to schools with more students simply because they have more shots at the so-called 2-point lottery. Do they get those 2 points for the given categories? So that's my concern. It's not, it's good intention, but there are limitations to the sample, the end count of 20 rule, and then causing schools to drop out of a number of cells.
Thank you, Member Guyer.
Yes.
Yeah, a similar observation is that the schools that are large and very diverse, they stand a better chance of scoring, having many opportunities to get those 2 points, whereas the schools that are considerably smaller do not have the end size at different grade levels and different subgroups. It's going to be considerably more difficult for them to get those points.
Thank you, Member Jordan. Chairman Schlesman, did any other committee members have a comment?
Hearing none, it sounds like we can move on to the ELL.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, the next item is item 6, presentation discussion regarding English language learner ELL issues within the A through F accountability plan and business rules, and that was compiled by Member Bachna.
Thank you. So there were 2 questions around this that I was sent. The first question was setting aside the end count. Does this measure discriminate enough throughout the plan, meaning how many schools receive full points? I didn't model this on the 912, but I did look at the K-8 file, and 246 schools received the full points for this measure, which was approximately almost 38% of schools received the full points on this measure. So to me, it's probably not discriminating as much as it could right now. I don't know if people have further comments on that.
Chair Schlesman, Member Bachna, I apologize. Can you repeat that one last time?
So approximately 38% of the K-8 schools earn the full percentage points for this measure, EL points.
And do we know what percent of schools, actually both K-8 and 912 traditional, are even eligible? Because my understanding is that ELL is an ESSA requirement and therefore must be part of the accountability plan for the state. But how many schools are even, and we had a reduced end size or end count, excuse me, for ELL. how many schools were even eligible.
Chairman Schlesman, members of the committee, if I can clarify your question, are you asking how many schools would be eligible for the ELL points if they hit the end count of 20? I'm not fully understanding your question, so
Right.
I'm seeking clarification.
And maybe that was in the points eligible. Let me go back and ask it this way. So of the 38% that you found, Member Bachna, were those of the schools that were eligible for ELL points?
It was of the schools that had points in that category.
Okay. And was that only K-8?
That was only
So we
K-8.
still need
I
to.
haven't looked
Yeah,
at the
okay,
912
okay,
file.
okay.
So Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachna, if 38% of the schools are receiving full points, and I believe you stated your conclusion would be that it does not discriminate enough throughout the plan.
It doesn't seem to be discriminating too significantly.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachna, did you have a chance to look in the business rules to see how the ELL was calculated?
I think it's based on the standard deviation around the proficiency, school's proficiency around the standard deviation compared to the state's proficiency.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Bachna, could you address the second point in the question in regards to because some schools do not have access to ELL graduation points, would be the best way to calculate cut scores?
So to the best of my understanding, this was addressed with using the points total or possible for those schools was decreased that didn't have access to all the points. But that does put more emphasis on AZ merit data. I don't know if other people had a thought on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. My question is clarified with what you
Okay.
have said about eligibility. They even had the points. But even within the schools that had points, within K-8, only 38% of them received full points.
The full 10.
Yes.
Yes.
Chairman Schlesman, did any of the other committee members have any questions or concerns in regards to the ELL?
Throw something there.
Does the
Do
committee?
you have, I'm sorry.
I haven't spoken in a while, so I guess it's time
Yes,
to say
please.
something. My experience with ELL is that there are a number of problems with the accuracy of achievement test scores with ELL populations. So I would suggest that we investigate more thoroughly the accuracy of those scores. And that's a more fundamental issue than I think you're willing to deal with. But I think I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, that I have seen negative gain scores in Ames data in the past dealing with ELL, which I find impossible to interpret. And so I'd like to know if there are negative gain scores and how much, and how do we interpret those negative gain scores. And then also ELL is one of the risk factors. So if you combine ELL with poverty, you get a different kind of a variable that predicts the student will achieve less. And then the third point I'll make is with national assessment data and with Ames data, I have seen non-cooperation by EL students. As you know, they're slow readers, they're translating, they respond slowly, they run out of time, they tend to omit answers and they tend not to finish. And so how that result is scored, I think, is important, because a plotting student might be very accurate but may not have enough time to finish. And that student will get a low score, even though they've achieved fairly well. So that's an issue that we've not solved, and I think it colors the results of ELL students' scores.
Thank you, Member Haladina. Member Sussman, I would recommend that we take this ELL issue that Member Bachna was discussing, and we just take a little bit more of a look at it. I do know that the ELL, as well as the acceleration for both K8 and the ELL for 912, is going to play into the NCALT calculations with the data that you guys received today. So I believe that if we take what you've presented today, Member Bachna, and then also look into it a little bit further for Tuesday, we will draft what we have currently from you, and then more information can be added for the state board. Is that an agreement from the TAC?
Yeah, and I know I would be curious to see, although I understand the 38% full points, there is the possibility of other points. So I would like to see that distribution also, both for K8 and 912.
Okay.
Thank
Chairman
you.
Schlesman, Member Bachna, is that something that you can do?
Yes, I
Till
can.
Tuesday?
Based on that data, I can do it by Tuesday.
Okay.
Thank you, Member Bachna. Member Sussman, I would recommend that we move on to the next agenda item.
All right. So our next agenda item was one of the big questions, looking at the correlation of letter grades to free and reduced lunch. And I understand Member Geyer has a presentation, and whatever you would like to preface that with, Director
Chairman
Williams.
Schlesman, members of the TAC. So Member Geyer put together a lovely correlation between free and reduced lunch and the A through F accountability scores, including scatter plots, which I believe Member Haladina likes. So if you guys want to take a moment and just review that, and then Member Geyer can present his findings. It's also important to remember that correlations of free and reduced lunch affect the whole entire system, not just certain aspects of it.
Yeah, so I use the free data that's available to look at the relationship between free and reduced lunch, which is quantified as a coded variable going from 0 to 9, where 0 is 0 to 10, about 10%, up to 9, which is 90 to 100% of the students at a school receiving free and reduced lunches. And then I also looked at the accountability score, which is basically the ratio of total points earned out of total points eligible. I could not use just the total score because schools differed in the number of points in which they received. Some schools received 80 points, some were 90, some were 100 for the K to 8, just using K to 8 as an example. So I used proportions for the results that are shown in the scatter plots. You can see there, figure 1, figure 2. For the K to 8, you can see figure 1, and then for the 9 to 12, you can see figure 2. Those are the correlations. And the correlations generally ranged in the mid-50s, negative, between free and reduced lunch and accountability. I don't really have any more comment regarding the magnitude of those correlations. I will just say that when I reviewed the correlation between free and reduced lunch and proficiency, the correlations were in the 70s. And the correlations between growth and free and reduced lunch generally were much, much smaller. So again, I'm not going to try and interpret these correlations because I'm not familiar with the steps and methods that were used by the AAG team who was doing the original modeling. I don't want to get into judging their work by saying these correlations are high, low, moderate, so on. But I know that there was a concern and effort made by that group to try and reduce this correlation size. But yet, still we see there is a correlation, which likely is just not going to go away. It's just inherent in the relating achievement scores to free and reduced lunches. I do have some comments that can hopefully clarify some of what was happening with the free and reduced lunch variable. And I provide some breakdowns here of the schools that did not provide free and reduced lunch data. A majority of these schools are charter schools. And it turns out, based on accounts that I've received, that some number of charter schools simply do not serve lunch formally to their students. As a result, they are not going to have students receive free and reduced lunches because they're not providing them. So that's just a data dropout point to make there, that some of the reason you're seeing schools drop out is that they do not have free and reduced lunches because they do not have lunch. And this does pose a little bit of a challenge because generally charter schools, based on the results, looking at just the charter schools in this group, generally tend to score a little bit higher on the accountability measures. So those schools just dropped out of the study wholesale.
So thank you, Member Geyer, for making that point, because I've worked with charter schools, and actually this is a question that may need to go back to ADE, because I know of schools that collect the data using the form that is used for federal purposes to report free and reduced lunch eligibility, but they do not actually serve the lunches. So that is my question, is if those types of schools have shown up in this file that we've received, that if it's just eligibility or the actual serving of the lunch. Is that question clear?
Yeah.
So,
Chairman Schlesman, I believe that is clear.
Okay.
And we will work with the department to figure that out for you.
and the other thing, and thank you very much, Member Geyer, for providing this is a more sophisticated scatter plot than I was able to do, but I was curious which statistical package you used for this analysis. We talked about that last week.
Yes, I used Program R.
Program R.
Yeah.
Okay. And you also talked about eligible points. Did you just assign a numeric value for the letter grade? I missed that piece of your methodology.
Letter grades were not assigned as part of this correlation. It was simply looking at total points earned out of total points possible.
Eligible.
But yes,
Okay.
total points
Okay.
eligible, sorry. Yes, schools had to be receiving a letter grade in order to be included in this study. I did not include schools who dropped out due to not having a letter grade. Yep.
And just to let you know, we talked last week about having different packages look at things.
And Chairman Schlesman,
Yes.
although that is a concern, we're not going to address that at this time. So if Mr.
That's
Geyer wants to run his System R,
Yeah, it's just the letter R. Yeah,
and Member Jordan wants to run it off when he's
As PSS.
when
Okay.
he's running, they can talk and meet and
Sure.
discuss their findings. Because going forward, as long as direction is given to me from the board, I'm looking to find a consultant to work with some of this modeling.
Okay.
So the programming would stay consistent because one person would be doing it.
And just to, because my method was less sophisticated, but I got similar Pearson values to what you have. I got a 5.55 and you have a 0.56 for K8. My method was not as sophisticated. I have a smaller correlation than your 0.5. I got 0.45, but again, I used a numeric value for the letter grades, not points earned. So I'm sure yours is more precise. So thank you very much.
Yeah, there'll be. Yeah, I don't want to get into why the correlations would be larger. Just maybe
Right.
audience, but
And
I believe you.
Chairman Schlesman, Member Geyer. So going off what you presented, Member Geyer, is there anything that you would like to bring forward in this report to the board in regards to the free and reduced lunch correlations?
I just think it's something for the board to be aware of, that you can't say that the free and reduced lunch correlation was removed by adoption of the growth and proficiency model for K to 8, just as an example. I think it's important to be aware that it's still there, but again, it's going to just be inherent in the proficiency being included in this model.
Okay.
So I really, like I said, I don't want to judge, because we're getting into judging what the correlation, how well this does at that objective. And
Member Guyer, I think this is good information to give the board, though, so that they're aware. I know many board members are concerned with the correlation of free and reduced lunch, and so hopefully this would help to answer some of their concerns that they have.
okay.
Yes, Member.
I find the scatter plot very useful, and I just want to everyone note the outliers. There are a fair number of outliers, and I think it behooves all of us to investigate who are these outliers and why are they outliers, because they're very peculiar. And if you remove outliers, you can invalidate them. The correlation will improve, of course. So, which is not what we want.
Yeah, the outliers are in the 9 to 12 correlation, and they probably are telling us something, because they are the high FRL schools. Some of them, for whoever they are scoring low on the overall accountability.
They could be behavioral problems. They could be a lot of things that we can't control.
So
Do any other committee members have any questions or concerns regarding Member Guyer's report?
Well, I hope we note that even though my method was less sophisticated, I had similar, not exactly the same, but similar results, so that's encouraging. And I remember Member Hovanich talked about similarities. Do you have any comment on this agenda item? Member Hovanich?
Not right now.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have any other comments among the group on this agenda item?
Are we still disputing different statistical packages producing? We're not going there?
It sounds like we're not.
Okay, good.
So, Chairman / Member Halladino, we're not going to dispute those at this time.
Okay.
Chairman Schlesman, I believe that this is great work that Member Guyer has completed, and it will be brought to the board. I will include it in the report that I will be drafting this evening. We will discuss further some of the key issues that were brought up today in regards to the other agenda items, and I will provide that to the members of the TAC. Moving forward in the agenda, we do have 2 call to the publics, if you wish to call that agenda item.
Yes, so please call to the publics.
The first call to the public today is Gary Bay, followed by Mark Jorgenstead.
Members, my name is Gary Bay, and I'm speaking as myself today. I do represent the Leona Group Charter Schools and Arizona Virtual Academy. But today, this is just my own observation. There was some discussion about differentiating between proficiency and growth. Perhaps another interesting way to look at it might be differentiating the weighting within growth. My guess is that higher proficiency schools are going to measure better on SGT. Lower proficiency schools may measure better on SGP. So anyway, I don't know. The analysis might be interesting to see, and that was my only thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mark Jorgenstead, Executive Director, Arizona School Administrators. I want to thank you for the hard work that you're doing, the number of reports that are being generated. Regarding those reports, and I know that the time frame is an issue, as a spectator in the meeting, it renders some of the discussions, for example, in agenda item number 1, you were referring to options. That discussion is a bit opaque to the audience when we have no way of seeing the options that you're viewing. So I'm hopeful that in the future, as many of those reports as possible can be made available to the public online prior to the meeting if possible, so we can have more transparency, or even I know some of them were obtained, as I heard you say, just before the meeting. And so I know that's time frame is difficult with these, but even after the meeting, if they could be available to the public, it would help us understand what was discussed, and also when we report back to our members, we can make sure we do so with complete accuracy to what's going on. A couple of weeks ago, I referred to growth, which is of great interest to our members, and I quoted Griffith and Petrilli, and then Chairman Schlesman requested the source of that, and I sent an incorrect link. So to avoid that, I've actually brought copies of that article here, and I highlighted the particular quotes that I made so you can see that I was being accurate. And this growth issue maintains great interest to us, and despite the comments of one of your members, Member Hovenetz, who really does not seem to see growth as a valuable part of the formula and really stresses proficiency. Petrilli and Griffith really, in their article, see proficiency as a huge problem. And Member Haladina talked about the risk factors that are inherent in some of the measures of proficiency. Petrilli and Griffith also, though, do mention the instability of growth and make a suggestion that perhaps eventually longitudinal measures of growth as we progress should be introduced into the formula to downplay some of the instability of growth measures. So that's a suggestion that as we get further years into the formula, that could ameliorate some of the instability in growth. But as an organization, we certainly wish to advocate for the strong emphasis on growth in this formula. Thank you for your kind attention and your hard work.
Thank you.
Chairman Schlesman, there are no further public comments.
So for point number 9, and you anticipate we will meet again on
Tuesday, November 28th at 12 noon here. Please send me an email if you cannot attend in person but would be calling in. Chairman Schlesman has let me know that she could potentially be calling in, so Member Geyer, being vice chair, you will lead the meeting on Tuesday. For that meeting, just to recap today, Member Geyer and Member Jordan will work together to model some of the options with the non-typical grade configurations. I would hope that Member Geyer and Member Jordan would bring the modeling back to the committee and provide that to me so that we could have that document be available to the public prior to the meeting. And then board staff will work on compiling some of the conversations we had today in regard to the different agenda items, and we will bring that report back to the committee members. Yeah. Is there anything else that the committee would like to discuss at the 28th meeting?
May I? What's the possibility of having a work study session among us? Would that? I'm posing that question because it may be a better way for us to discuss some of the.
So, Member Jordan, would you want to have a work study session between now and when?
Yeah, that'll be the difficult part, is just trying to squeeze it in between now and the 28th. So.
Right, so we have Thanksgiving this week, with some people do leave Wednesday and aren't back on Friday. We could potentially have a study session prior to this December 4th meeting, but the meeting was scheduled for the 28th because the 27th is not available. You can always contact members of the TAC as long as you don't break open meeting law. So you can't go over 5. I would suggest you stay with 1 or 2 people. And then always CC me on email so that I'm aware of the conversations that you're having. with one another. I do think work study sessions would be a great thing. I just don't know if we have the time currently to fit that into all of your schedules.
Okay.
And just to let you know, I also agree with the idea of some study sessions, especially for, I know that our timeline is very tight for the 4th, but as we consider things moving forward, I know State Board of Ed has tasked us with some questions about the alternative school model, and I think it would be very productive to have a work or a study session to educate a lot of us about alternative schools, and then some of the other items that have been brought up for future, and I'm not talking even January or February, but after that point, when we move to another phase of our work, that study sessions would be a good idea. And I'm assuming, and I'm good with that too, that because there is so much to do right now, we'll talk about a standing meeting and what works for everybody once we get this initial piece with the 2 priorities. Thank you very much, Member Bachna, that you asked about those, that we get those completed.
Chairman Session, members of the committee, I think that's a great idea. Does anyone else have any topics that they would like to discuss for the 28th meeting?
No.
Okay.
No.
Thank you.
You would need a motion to adjourn.
Yeah,
with a second.
I was just going to move to that. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
And then you say we are adjourned.
We are
You say the
adjourned
time.
at 12:02, I'm thinking. Thank you.